WisconsinEye's Campaign 2024 programming is sponsored by Wisconsin Counties Association, Nicolet National Bank, Wisconsin Hospital Association, Operating Engineers Local 139, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, the Wisconsin Laborers District Council, and North Central State's Regional Council of Carpenters. To support programs like this, please consider a tax-deductible donation at wiseye.org/donate or by texting WisCI to 44321.
U.S. Representative Mark Pocan of Town of Vermont is the Democratic incumbent candidate for the 2nd Congressional District. The election is November 5th. Congressman Pocan, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
What is your campaign's key message? Why are you running for re-election?
I think right now it's bluntly to save democracy a little bit. This session has been incredibly unproductive and bad. I think we're on track to have the fewest number of bills done since the Congress of 1860 and maybe 1839, and we can't get a farm bill done. That was supposed to be done a year ago, September 30th. We haven't got our budget bills done. The current Republican majority simply can't govern. But with this presidential campaign and watching the really hateful rhetoric and the looking back at January 6th and saying, it was a love fest, all this kind of stuff, it's so ridiculous and over the top that we just have to get back to having our democracy preserved. And I think there's, a lot of things that we can do to try to accomplish that. But right now, really, it's not even the 101 level of Congress. It's very basic things we got to get done.
What do you see as the most pressing challenge currently before the country? And what's an example of a piece of legislation or some action you'll be taking when you are reelected, if you're reelected?
Yeah, so to what I just said, I think the bill that Democrats have had is our H.R. 1, the first bill we introduced, is the most comprehensive campaign finance, elections, and ethics reform bill. Does things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make sure that no one is disenfranchised, no matter what state you live in, for ability to vote, going after things like Citizens United, allowing big corporations to put this money in ways that never was intended, I think, by the founders of this country. And just to really, if you can get those core issues in place, every other issue will fall in place a little better. So I think getting those fundamentals that we have in that bill would be really important.
How do you see the state of the economy currently, and what would you propose that would incentivize economic growth, specifically here in Wisconsin?
Sure. First of all, I think the economy is actually pretty strong. A lot of the bills that we passed in the last session, the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, have created jobs in some cases for a decade or longer are going to be in place. Rebuilding our roads and bridges, our water delivery systems, putting in electric vehicle charging stations, so many things in that sense are really strong. We came out of COVID better than most every other country, but we have some lingering inflation. I think that's still an issue around the cost of food and gas and housing. The good news is around food and gas in particular, we can go after the price gougers because I think that's largely why we have that pricing where it's at. In fact, on the grocery side, I think it's 4 companies are responsible for 65% of the groceries in this country. So when you have that kind of consolidation, you can have a lot of prices that remain artificially high, and that's a problem. Gas, same thing is true. Back in May, the head of the FTC, Chair Lena Khan, went after, there was a guy with an oil company who was selling to Exxon, and in the process of this, they found hundreds of messages that he had to OPEC, a foreign entity, about price fixing and supply fixing, and all he really got was a slap on the hand. He can't join the Exxon board for 5 years. But we see this kind of thing happening to the American people. So fighting those things. And then I think on the housing side, just increasing housing supply, going after the private equity firms that are buying up housing and artificially rising, making the prices increase, and getting more affordable housing in place will help. All things I think I hear Kamala Harris talking about, Democrats talking about trying to do. But those are the lingering issues. But the economy itself is sound. We just have to address some of the price gouging that's occurring right now.
Sure, you mentioned inflation still above pre-pandemic rates. People are certainly seeing that in prices. Some would point to government spending as a cause for that. Are there some parts of government spending, federal government spending, that could be reduced?
Well, first of all, the argument is just ridiculous on its face because we had global inflation coming out of COVID. All of a sudden, everyone wanted stuff and there was nothing there. A lot of demand, limited supply. So that has worldwide inflation. You can't say that the U.S., our spending in the United States, it caused every country in the world to have inflation, right? So that's why it's just kind of a ridiculous argument that some put out there. However, we always should be concerned about how we spend tax dollars. That's something that's important as the stewards of those tax dollars. I would point to the tax cut that we had under Donald Trump, where 83% of the money went to the top 1% of people. So it largely wasn't shared with the general populace. But that added $7 trillion to the debt, more than every president in history combined, was just added by one president, a guy who claims that he's responsible when it comes to things fiscally. I think things like that are a bad idea, and I'd like to reverse a lot of those because those are really tax expenditures. So whether it's a healthcare expenditure or an expenditure in education, a tax cut is still a tax expenditure. So when you give that money, especially to the wealthiest, that could have been spent on other issues, I think that's a bad idea. So I think those are some of the areas that we could address and really make sure that we're, one, bringing the debt down, and two, really taking care of the vast majority of Americans and not a very small sector.
It has become increasingly expensive to raise a family in this country. What policies do you support that making raising a family more affordable? And for instance, is it expanding the child tax credit? Is it expanding child care subsidies, or are there other ideas?
Yeah, you just mentioned two of the best, I think, that were part of the original Build Back Better agenda. We did have, for a limited time, the child tax credit, which is probably the single most important thing to keep kids out of poverty. And I think a lot of people, including people who aren't Democrats, support this. In fact, a lot of people realize that it is that single best way to keep kids out of poverty. Childcare, what's something Joe Biden and Kamala Harris wanted to do, but weren't able to get done because of the votes in the Senate, was to keep it limited to no more than 7% of your income if you made up to 250% of the median income. Right now in Wisconsin, you could easily, for a 3-year-old, pay over $15,000 for childcare. But if you made as a couple $100,000, under that proposal, you'd have paid no more than $7,000. That would be an extra $8,500 in your pockets, and it would help get people who want to be able to be in the workforce to have that child care. So those are two, certainly, but I think also Kamala Harris has proposed helping people with down payments for houses and some other issues. So I think there's a lot we can do to support the middle class and those aspiring to be in the middle class. The way you do it, I think, is the way that we've seen Kamala Harris and Joe Biden do it, which is making sure corporations are paying more of their fair share, getting rid of those offshore tax havens that, by the way, they want to be brought back in Project 2025 that Donald Trump had 140 of his staff help write. Those are really bad ideas, so we want to do the ideas that I mentioned in the beginning: child tax credit, helping on child care, additional assistance for housing. Those kind of middle-class measures are what matter.
You mentioned housing. We know that's a big concern for Wisconsinites. You talked about, are you supportive of Vice President Harris's proposal for a $25,000 subsidy for first-time home buyers?
Yeah, some sort of subsidy. I don't know if we've seen all the details fleshed out, but I think there's a number of things. And also going after those private equity firms. My nephew recently, I guess 3 years ago, but moved to Georgia. And as he was looking at houses, he would see that they were listed on Zillow. Zillow was buying them up. So that was driving pricing up, and it was one entity buying all the housing in the area that he was looking to. That's happening across the country, and that's helping to raise the prices. So there's things like that as well.
What about for renters? Is there a solution for renters?
Once you have more housing supply in general, that will help on the renting supply as well. And then also making sure there's no price gouging by landlords, and that's another thing I know Kamala Harris has talked about.
Social Security, as you know, faces potential long-term financing shortfalls. What reforms to Social Security do you support? Yeah,
so to me, the no-brainer way to make this solved is honestly you just lift the cap at which you no longer pay into Social Security. Every year it changes a little bit. This year I think it's around $170,000, give or take. But when you make $170,000, you don't pay another dime in on any additional dollar. No other tax is like that, right? So it's kind of a regressive tax as opposed to how it normally is. The more you make, the more you pay as a percent. If we just lift that cap and said no matter what you pay as a percent of your income like every other person does, you would extend the future of the fund for 75 years. So that's an easy fix. There's some bills that do it for people over 400,000. But also what you can make on Social Security, I think, is around 21,000, and after that you get penalized. I think if you adjusted that for inflation, you'd be really more at about 50,000. We should probably alter that. The increase you get in Social Security every year is attached to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. But that accounts for things like gasoline and a lot of things that seniors don't spend more money on. Seniors spend more money on things like medications and healthcare. So there's an index called the CPI-E, which would give seniors a little better increase, but it ties to where they spend their money. I'd like to see things like that addressed as well.
So do you support raising the retirement age for Social Security, even for younger people?
No, that'd be an awful, awful idea. And the reason why, first of all, it's a cut to Social Security. So both the Republican Study Committee, the largest caucus in the House for Republicans, has proposed doing that, as has the Heritage Foundation, which is the main group behind Project 2025. So we know what will happen if Donald Trump is elected. They'll likely look at that. But if you work with your hands or you work in the trades, it's not like your body can still do that at that point. And it would be very unfair in how that would work for people. So we pay into that fund all our life through our Social Security, the taxes we pay in our paychecks. We shouldn't have someone taking that away from us, the promise that we've paid into. I think, again, just by lifting the cap, you actually solve the problem. So don't create a new problem. Let's just say rich people should pay everything that everyone else has to pay. And if we did that, you really have addressed it.
I want to move on to healthcare. As you know, medical systems are facing numerous headwinds in the form of inflation, workforce development, and issues around Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, resulting in fewer services and even the closure of a hospital system in western Wisconsin. What would you do to preserve access to care and prevent future closures like that?
Yeah, first of all, we're the only industrialized country that doesn't have universal health care, which it's kind of a bad statement, right? And I think the Affordable Care Act has helped, tens of millions of people get access. It's helped all of us who may have pre-existing conditions have health care, because remember 2010, you could not get offered health insurance if you were a woman, because having a pregnancy was considered a pre-existing condition. So that's crazy, obviously. But making sure that we're protecting and enhancing Affordable Care Act. I would love to see us go to a Medicare for All system. I think Medicare works. You could actually expand it either by lowering the threshold of the age or other ways to make sure more people have access to it. But also, I think just in general, we have to be very careful around things like on Medicare. There's a program called Medicare Advantage. That's private insurance alternative. Very smart lobbyists. They were allowed to use the word Medicare in the name of their program. That lobbyist probably has got a nice resort in the Caribbean right now for all that. But it actually was designed to see if we could have cost savings, and now it costs more than traditional Medicare, and a majority of people now in the country are on it. But if you have a care that you need, you have to have prior authorization, and they turn down millions of people a year. It's one of the biggest complaints I get as a member of Congress from people. Yet when they're appealed, over 85% are approved. So delayed care is often conditional health declines and sometimes death.
Is there some role for Congress then in correcting that?
Absolutely, and I'm working on that literally every day in Congress. There's a group of us trying to go after that. Only Medicare is Medicare, and this is the open enrollment period right now. And I just ask people to think about that, really look closely at the difference, because when you get to that need part on those privatized plans, that prior authorization, or they won't let you have what you need right away, you have to try something first, is all delayed care and can really cost you greatly.
Local communities in Wisconsin, as you know, are faced with a growing number of issues. For example, issues related to water quality and PFAS, or perhaps a sudden influx of refugees like Wisconsin saw in 2021. How will you plan to collaborate with local governments, or perhaps what are some examples of how you've done that to ensure that they have the necessary resources? Yeah,
I think we try to do that, especially during COVID. We did a very good job of that. But having, originally served on the Dane County Board of Supervisors, local government, gone to the state legislature, and then now in Congress, I've kind of served in all those levels, so I've kind of been there, done that, and I can help kind of explain it to people who may not otherwise realize you can't just mandate something without funds. And if you do, then at some point it has to be taken care of, and often it's local government or state government that gets squeezed. So I think we did a great job during COVID in addressing that, and I think using that as probably the role model for any future activities makes sense.
You mentioned your position on taxes and that you won't be supporting the extension of and making permanent of the Trump tax cuts from 2017. What are some specific tax cuts or tax reforms that you do support?
Yeah, I mean, so next year is the year that we'll be doing all this in 2025 because it comes up in certain periods of time. So I think anything we do should be focused on those who are either in the middle class or aspiring to be in the middle class.
Who are those people to you?
Well, I think that a lot of people use under 400,000. I would probably even take it a little down from there for income. But there are things that we can do from things like the child tax credit, even though it's maybe not income tax policy, it's still tax policy. That would be part of what we're going to talk about. To making sure that we're keeping the deductions in place the middle class uses. To not having maybe some of the other deductions in place. I mean, prior to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, you literally could have a one-room office in Ireland and claim that's your corporate headquarters. And all the profits you made in the United States, you could attribute to that one-room empty office and not have to pay tax. Well, they fixed that. But that's policy that wants to get turned over in Project 2025. It's making sure we don't go down that path and instead restore tax fairness for the average working person. And I think that's going to be, without question, the biggest debate in 2025.
Should there be federal abortion policy passed by Congress, or should the issue be left up to the states?
Yeah, we need to codify what was in Roe versus Wade over half a century. I think it worked well in this country. Donald Trump confusingly said everyone asked for it to go to the states, maybe everyone on his campaign staff, but it wasn't everyone in the country for sure. And now it's a mess, and it shouldn't matter what state you live in, what health care you can get, and it should be the decision of a woman and her doctor and her family, not the decision of, quite honestly, a sex offender and Donald Trump. So because of that, I think having the federal law in place as we had it with Roe versus Wade was the best thing to have, but to try to break it out like Donald Trump has done with overturning Roe versus Wade has made things quite chaotic.
You wouldn't support a referendum for Wisconsin voters to weigh in on this?
No, because it should be done nationally.
Should be done nationally. Yeah. What is your position on climate change, and what congressional actions do you support that balance environmental and economic concerns with economic growth and job creation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're all interconnected. It's not one versus the other. Look at the last hurricane that just happened. First of all, despite what Marjorie Taylor Greene tells you, we don't control hurricanes. We can't direct them to certain populations. I do work with idiots. But reality is there's huge economic concerns when that happens to an area. And we're seeing more intensified events because we're not addressing climate change. So quite honestly, economic concerns and climate concerns are the same, but we need to do far more to address those climate change problems that exist. Part of it we're doing, I think, by moving more to electric vehicles and trying to address those issues, but much more needs to be done. The Inflation Reduction Act probably was the most comprehensive approach to anything we've done up to this date, but I think we can add on a lot in a future Congress.
What about fossil fuel production? Does that need more regulation? What's your policy
Well,
on
I'm
that?
hoping we won't need as much very soon. By going to electric vehicles, you're going to far lessen the need for that. And right now, it's such a terrible system, period, right? I mean, it causes environmental concerns when you're pulling oil out, when you're moving it around the country, but also when you buy it from other countries, where often it's in very volatile political regions. So there are many reasons to do what we're doing right now, is transitioning, as is the industry, to these other vehicles. So hopefully much of this debate will be a former debate very soon.
Moving on to foreign policy.
Yeah.
Should the United States continue to provide military support to Ukraine, and for how long and in what form?
Yeah, yes, and however it takes, right? I mean, this was a foreign country, Russia invading a sovereign nation, and if we don't want to have this happen in other countries and have more entanglements, it's better to do what we're doing. I'm glad we're not putting young American men and women on the ground. I think that's something I've talked to both Democratic and Republican colleagues who agree on.
You wouldn't support that going
At
that
this
far.
point, no. I mean, it depends on conditions, clearly, but right now there's no reason to. But I think the support we're doing right now is what's needed.
Until it's resolved.
Yes. Yeah.
How should the United States be balancing support for Israel with concerns over civilian casualties in Gaza?
Yeah, I've just listening this morning, and we thought with getting the head of Hamas that that was the opportunity to have a ceasefire and get the hostages returned, and yet the war is widening, and largely because of how Netanyahu's handling it. I think he's handled it awfully, and I think at some point we have to have a much more serious conversation about just giving open-ended offensive weapons to someone who disagrees with our stated goals. We want a two-state solution. That's been the United States position for decades. It's been on the table for quite a while, and he does not support that. And just giving him more weapons to be used, I think, in ways of collective punishment, like he has in Gaza, to have 45,000 plus people killed, another 100,000 injured, most of them being children and women who clearly were not combatants, has been a horrendous way to deal with this. So as horrific as the attack was on October 7th and the taking of hostages, so has the response by Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think we have to use our power as, I would say, the most powerful nation on the earth a little stronger in making sure that we don't just allow this to continue. And I think that may be to start really stopping the way that we're just giving offensive weapons in the way we are.
Has the Biden-Harris administration been strong enough on this issue?
I think this is one where I've had some disagreements with Joe Biden specifically. He had announced he was going to stop the big 2,000-pound bombs that were just used very blanket-wise in Gaza, and that was only for a matter of, I think, weeks, and then we went back to doing that again. That was bad policy. I think Netanyahu is thumbing his nose literally at the United States' will and what we're asking for. And as much as Israel is a friend of the United States, if you go out on a Friday night with a friend and they have 12 shots and a six-pack of beer, you don't let them get in their car and drive. You take away their keys. They're still your friend, but you make sure that they don't hurt themselves or someone else. We need to do the same thing with Netanyahu.
I have a couple of campaign-related questions
Sure.
for you. Are you troubled by the record-breaking amounts of out-of-state money being solicited by Wisconsin campaign operatives to influence our local elections?
Just the vast number of money, period, is unbelievable. I'm watching the exponential growth. I've been doing this for 30 years, and when I look at what state legislative races even are going for, much less our federal races and statewide races, that's part of why we need H.R. 1, the most comprehensive campaign finance ethics and election review bill that we've ever had passed. If we continue down this path, the only people who will be able to run for office are the very, very wealthy and the very, very pliable, who are willing to say and do whatever to get elected. And that is a threat to our democracy, and that's why I keep coming back to that as one of the most important issues we need to address.
A lot of money is being spent on negative ads across many, many races, these ads that walk that fine line between accuracy and exaggeration. At a time when the nation is so divided, what would you say to somebody who might ask you to stop running negative ads? Yeah,
first of all, we don't, so I don't have to be asked. That's fine. But I think obviously everything should be factual. And sometimes what someone calls negative is just maybe they didn't like how it was presented, right? I mean, if you own a bank in California and you have a $7.5 million mansion in Laguna Beach, California, and you're named one of the most influential people in Orange County, California, you can't be surprised that someone says you're from California, right? Like Eric Hovde. So that's not necessarily negative. It's factual. But I do think when people get out lying or attacking spouses
taking
is one.
Things out of context?
Taking things out of context, but again, 30-second ads. I mean, I'm hoping people do a little more research than what they're getting on commercials, right? Because obviously you're not getting any content in that little bit of time. And I think that's our due diligence of making sure that we at least verify what we think may be true. If something really bothers you or you really like about a candidate, still verify it, because there could be more to it.
Let's move on to education. As you know, the number of Wisconsin school districts going to referendum asking local taxpayers for funding is increasing. Is there a need to increase federal funding for K-12 education?
No, you got to stop the stupid law that the state put in place that sets the barrier that every time you need to raise some additional revenue for a school district, you have to go to referendum for it. We didn't used to have that, and now it's become chaotic.
It's a state issue.
It's totally a state issue, and it's a totally we've now seen the practice of this, and it does not work. It doesn't matter what party you're from. We should get rid of it.
There's a lot of federal education mandates that some would say are unfunded.
Yeah, but the funding predominantly for education comes from property taxes. That's how it's always been, and I don't expect that to change. But I do think stupid ideas from the state, like making them go to referendum so often, is not helpful at all.
Do you support federal student loan forgiveness?
Yes.
Across the board for anybody?
No, just I think what we're seeing right now happening, and I think also I would like to get back to what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden talked about years ago about even free community college or initial higher education, being able to do that. There's a lot of things it's advantageous for society in general to do this, and certainly. When you look at student loans and the cost of repaying student loans, and I have so many people who come by, including people in the medical field or helping in the public sector, we need to do more.
I'm going to move to immigration, a big issue in this election. What would you do to focus on an effort to fix what many feel is a broken system?
Yeah, I mean, Congress hasn't done its job for decades in this area, and it's really not up to any president because they can't. They can do a few Band-Aids, but they don't have the power to do what Congress needs to do. When I first got here to Washington in 2013, there was a bill that passed out of the Senate with 69 bipartisan votes to have additional protections at the borders, a pathway to citizenship for aspiring Americans. Then John Boehner, who was the Republican speaker at the time, never took the bill up. Then it got really politicized under Donald Trump to the point that it's a toxic issue. You can't even have a rational conversation about it anymore.
Are you willing to compromise on this issue?
Well, of course. I mean, it's not even compromise. It's just we've broken the only way to get here right now is through asylum, and everyone's obviously not here for asylum. But it takes 2 3/4 years on average for someone to have their case heard, which is ridiculous because Republicans won't put funding for the people who should do that. So their rhetoric doesn't match at all the political rhetoric and their actual practice. The bill this year that the Senate almost had done in a bipartisan way until Donald Trump said no, he wants to keep it as a campaign issue, would have taken that 2 3/4 year time down to 3 months. And you might not have taken a 6-month journey to get here if you thought you were going to be sent back in 3 months if it wasn't correct.
So you think that's a big part that needs to be fixed is the asylum process?
Well, just and just what other legal pathways, and we're not clear anymore, so that becomes the only one. It is just so off, and the political rhetoric has become so much that it is hard to have what should be a rational conversation. I would say go back to that 2013 bill because clearly it had some bipartisan support and work off of that.
Try to revive that.
And work off of that. We could figure something out.
We're down to our final 2 questions. What's the biggest difference between you and your opponent?
I mean, actually, he's a very respectful person. We did a debate last week, and unlike most every other campaign I've watched, we may disagree on issues, but we try to do it respectfully. Maybe it's because we're both from Wisconsin, but I just think he has a different approach than I do, and I really think that's the biggest difference. I have nothing negative to say about someone who wants to put this much time of their life into trying to run for office and put their issues forward. I just think we have different perspectives coming in.
Given the deep national partisan divide, what's one issue that you think has the potential to be resolved that would bring the parties together? Yeah,
I mean, the Farm Bill should be, right? It's just it got partisan by, again, this current Republican majority. But we all have agricultural communities, and part of the Farm Bill affects agriculture. Part of it affects food support for people of lower income. So it affects people in urban and rural areas. So it crosses all political partisan lines. That should be a no-brainer. Like food, air, water. Those are like things that shouldn't be partisan, and that bill should. But it was due last year, September 30th. This Republican Congress that is hitting the record of 1860 in ineffectiveness hasn't been able to get it done. They kicked the can till this year, September 30th.
You're hopeful.
If we can get to it, that should bring us back together. It's just they haven't been able to do it because they made rules that they have to pass it with their own votes, which, again, isn't how things are done, but it's how they're doing things, and that's part of the problem. But hopefully something around Farm Bill would be the type of bill that should be less partisan.
All right. Thank you, U.S. Representative Mark Pocan, the incumbent Democratic candidate for the 2nd Congressional District. The election is November 5th. Congressman Pocan, thank you for talking with WisconsinEye.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
This programming is brought to you by our generous sponsors. Thank you for watching.